Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lori Pasteryak from the Fairfield Museum and History Center. I'm the Director of Interpretation at the museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual History Bites, Connecticut Women and the Battle for the Ballot with Dr. Kelly Marino. So Kelly Marino is the coordinator of Women's Studies at Sacred Heart University, and I'll be welcoming her on in just a bit. But I wanted to take a moment to, of course, thank our sponsors for this event. So the Fairfield Museum is in the middle of what is called our Suffrage series right now. And we'd really like to send a special thanks out to Connecticut Humanities, as well as the Fairfield County Community Foundation's Fund for Women and Girls, as well as our partners in this series, the League of Women Voters of Fairfield, Connecticut. So with that, I wanted to also take a moment to point out that the Fairfield Museum is open to the public right now with special guidelines. You can, of course, find out our hours and days, which we're open daily from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., as well as all of our upcoming events and programs on our website, www.fairfieldhistory.org. And so today, part of this History Bites, the Connecticut Women and the Battle for the Ballot with Dr. Kelly Marino, we are streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube platforms, as well as our website from our calendar of events. If you want to add a comment or a question, we will be seeing those, and we will drop those questions and comments at the end of Dr. Marino's presentation. So in about probably 1:15 or so, we'll start looking at those comments and questions, and she'll be answering them live on here. So if you want to ask a question or a comment, please log into your Facebook or your YouTube account and post them there right on our live streaming platform, and we'll be glad to answer them later. And so with that, Dr. Kelly Marino, the coordinator of Women's Studies at Sacred Heart University, is joining us today to give a talk on, of course, the suffrage campaign here in Connecticut and the important role that some local women played in the movement. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Kelly to the stage. Hi, Kelly, how are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to share a little bit about my research with you today. I've been studying suffrage since I was an undergrad many years ago. I got involved in it. I'm actually from Connecticut originally, and I needed a research project, and I discovered this woman from Cromwell, which is actually where I'm from. Her name's Emily Miller Pearson, and she was a leading suffragist who at that time hadn't gotten a lot of attention in a lot of the local and state narratives. And so I really fell in love with her story at a young age because I felt like I could really identify with her, because she was a woman who didn't really follow a traditional path. She pursued higher education like myself, and she actually worked as a teacher for a number of years. And I myself was training as a teacher at that point. And I noticed that a lot of the suffragists actually were educators and came from a background either working as school administrators or as teachers, and that really resonated with me. And that's what really drew me into the story of the movement. And I've always been really passionate about local and state history and the stories that are, relevant to our own the areas that we kind of have grown up in and we see in our daily lives. I think that's really powerful to be able to connect with the stories and relate to the different locations and some of these figures. And so my presentation I'm going to pull up, and it just looks at the story of the suffrage movement in Connecticut as sort of like an overview of some of the things that happened within our own state during the time period of the campaign for the 19th Amendment. So let me pull up the PowerPoint that I have for you, and I will enlarge my screen here.
Well, thanks, Kelly, and we are looking forward to this, and again, we're happy to host you. So if, again, anyone, if you have questions or comments during the course of Dr. Marino's presentation, we'll be happy to entertain them on our Facebook and YouTube platforms, where you can drop in your comment and question there. You can just say hi, too. We always love to hear from people who are watching. And so thanks again. Here's Kelly.
Okay, so the story of the beginning of the organized suffrage movement in Connecticut, and I say organized because throughout the country, women had been promoting greater rights for a very long period before this, But prior to the period of the American Civil War, there was no unified movement. So I say that the organized movement really started in earnest in the period that followed the American Civil War. During the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, women in the North and the South had taken up many duties to support the home front in many states across the country, in addition to Connecticut. As one article commented, quote, Connecticut women were instrumental in the organization of aid societies, the Connecticut Soldiers Relief Association, and in hospitals. Wartime social life in every Connecticut town revolved around the lives of soldiers. Women, children, and those unable to fight in the war rolled bandages, knitted mittens, packed food, and made regimental flags. Wives of Connecticut soldiers even risked their lives to visit their husbands during in camps during the winter. These activities often challenged the women to leave the domestic sphere and take a greater role in public life. And after the Civil War was over, many women felt that they had proven their dedication to the country and the good that they could do if allowed a greater public presence. So by 1869, in the period after the American Civil War, women inspired by the work in the abolitionist movement, this work they had done during the war on the home front, they became, again, engaged in kind of thinking about their own status, thinking about their own role in society, and thinking about the inequality that existed all around them, particularly when they worked in the abolitionist movement that challenged slavery and promoted African-American equality. They started to really question their own status, and they banded together again, after the Civil War, to create their own national suffrage organizations for the first time, to push for women's rights. And so in the period following the Civil War, you have two major organized women's movements forming in the US, like the two major large-scale women's movements in the US. So in 1869, you have the formation of the American Women's Suffrage Association, the American Women's Suffrage Association, known as the AWSA, and the National Women's Suffrage Association, known as the NWSA. The American Women's Suffrage Association, or the AWSA, was headed by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, her husband. They basically favored encouraging grassroots suffrage activism on the state level that would not detract from the campaign for African American rights. Activists in this organization argued that the period that followed the American Civil War was the quote-unquote Negro hour. So it was a time for African Americans to push for their civil rights, and these people who were involved in the AWSA were basically worried about distracting from that campaign. They thought women's rights was important, but they didn't want to take away from the larger civil rights movement that was going on during this time period to push for African American equality. The National Women's Suffrage Association, the other organization that formed in 1869, the other women's organization, the NWSA, was headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And this group took a more controversial approach. It pushed for a federal amendment to grant women the right to vote, not caring about whether the campaign would detract from other social and political movements. Stanton, in particular, has been viewed in a controversial light in recent years because of comments that she made that argued for women's suffrage using nativist and racist rhetoric that suggested that white women deserved the vote first over minority groups because they were supposedly more civilized or superior. So again, you have two organizations, two national women's suffrage organizations forming in the period after the Civil War, the AWSA and the NWSA. And the primary difference is the people who were involved in the AWSA wanted to campaign at the state and local level only because they didn't want to take away from the campaign for African American rights. And the NWSA was more like, we need to push for women's right to vote at the national level. And we don't care if we're distracting from other social and political campaigns. So it wasn't until 1890 in the United States that the two organizations actually merged and united. And when the two organizations merged, they became known as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so this is the most common organization. We talk about the suffrage movement in the U.S. It's the one people most are familiar with, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And it formed out of the merger of those two groups. And it was the merger of the titles, the merger of the mission. So again, you have National American Women's Suffrage Association with the titles merging, but also the missions merge. So now the organization wants to campaign at both the state, local, and also the federal levels. And so by 1890, you had a new generation of women who had come to leadership in the suffrage campaign, and their vision had changed from their predecessors. The Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, having been established in 1869 at the state level, was actually one of the earliest grassroots suffrage bodies in the country. And based on my knowledge about the movement, I've always argued that it was likely an affiliate of the AWSA first, Lucy Stone's organization. And the reason that I argue this is because of the popularity of the abolitionist cause in the state of Connecticut and New England, particularly among reformers active in the group. So there's no official word on if the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association was linked to the AWSA or the NWSA, but I'm going to argue, based on my research, it was probably linked to the AWSA first, just because I know of a lot about these activists that were leaders' backgrounds and how they were big abolitionists during the time period. Little research has actually looked at the history of the suffrage movement in Connecticut prior to 1910. The records do exist for this early period. They're at the State Library in Hartford. They're handwritten notes, but they're illegible enough for a scholar interested in the topic to definitely do some research and write a larger project on it. So I think that's an area open to future research. There hasn't been a lot on the early movement, especially in the 19th century. According to scholar Carol Nichols, who's written the most extensive study of suffrage in Connecticut, but who also largely moves quickly through this early period, the early CWSA collected signatures for suffrage petitions. They rallied the government for suffrage and women's rights legislation in the state that would support the plight of working women and children. They advocated for temperance, married women's property rights, school suffrage, and more. Leaders in the early CWSA included people like Isabella Beecher Hooker of the famous Beecher family, all of whom were actively involved in social reform and even some nationally known. Her husband, John Hooker, was also a noted activist. The early CWSA also included other well-known figures nationally, including Frances Ellen Burr and Olympia Brown. However, Carol Nichols writes that, quote, the early movement in Connecticut was hardly a movement at all. The CWSA was small and did not attract energetic young leaders. So I would actually challenge that. And I think, again, that's an area wide open for further research and study, because I'm guessing that Nichols is not giving the early suffrage leaders in the state quite enough credit for what they did in the 19th century. Suffrage leaders in Connecticut did face stringent opposition because the government in the state was in the hands of a conservative majority that was not open to change, even though times were changing. So by the late 1800s and the early 1900s, westward expansion and industrialization were altering the American nation in many significant ways. Urban centers were experiencing astronomical growth. In 1860, only 16 cities had over 50,000 residents, but by 1890, about 1/3 of all Americans were city dwellers. Immigrants and their children were a major source of urban population growth. Immigrants during the period in particular came from areas of Southern and Eastern Europe. As the population in cities such as Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport expanded, so did the rates of disease, crime, low income and hazardous employment, overcrowding, and slum-like housing. Americans, Black and white, of the upper and middle classes took note, and they expressed concern, rallying the government to pass new legislation to deal with the issues of modern cities. Many Connecticut women noted the poor living conditions that the lower classes faced, including Katherine Hepburn, whose husband worked as a medical doctor in Hartford. Hepburn was particularly interested in sex hygiene, prostitution, and what we consider today to be the spread of STDs. She, like many other progressive women, believed that if women won the right to vote, they would have a greater influence in government to support legislation that would deal with the problems of the city and social reform. Hepburn became involved in the women's suffrage movement in 1909. That October, Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette, known for her slogan, "Deeds, Not Words," had visited Hartford for the first time to give a talk on suffrage, and Hepburn had attended the meeting. There she met Emily Miller Pearson. Pearson was a wealthy socialite from Cromwell, whose family had made it big in the floral industry. Pearson, well-educated and civically engaged, a school teacher by trade who had worked in Bristol, became fast friends with Katharine Hepburn, together founding the Hartford Equal Franchise League to promote women's suffrage after the event. By 1910, a younger generation of suffrage leaders from Hartford and Greenwich, including Hepburn and Pearson, had come together, and they had taken over leadership of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, working to push it in a new direction. Prominent new activists included Caroline Rutz Rees, Grace Gallatin Seton, and Dr. Valeria Hopkins Parker. These activists believed that winning women's suffrage, in the words of Carol Nichols, could make a more just and humane society. Many of the new leaders were middle and upper class women with higher education. My own argument is that they used, quote, educational theatrics, or tactics that were sensational, dramatic, and public to get attention for the vote, but also to teach the public about the cause by sending a particular message. The CWSA sent activists to give outdoor and indoor speeches at the meetings of state Sunday school associations, local political parties, the Chamber of Commerce, labor unions, Jewish organizations, meetings of college and university professors, women's aid societies, gatherings of corset workers, and the events of many other organizations throughout Connecticut. One particular popular location that suffragists showed up to speak at was state fairs. CWSA representatives set up booths, they arranged short addresses, they distributed literature, and they sold buttons. They stopped at many outdoor parks and recreational places to give talks about women's rights. In the summer of 1914, for example, suffragists pulled over at Ocean Beach Park in New London and used a rowboat as a speaking platform, taking to the sea to promote women's right to vote. Connecticut suffragists also took advantage of cheap and popular urban entertainment, such as plays and early forms of motion picture, to campaign for their cause. In 1914, assistant state organizer Elise Gregory caught media attention by organizing performances of the witty play of English origin, How the Vote Was Won. On another occasion in 1915, Connecticut suffragists showed a photo play called Your Girl and Mine at the Palace Theater in Hartford. Such events drew large audiences, educating the public about suffrage for a low cost. CWSA activist efforts led to the formation of many new suffrage bodies at the state and local level throughout Connecticut. Essentially, the women that took over in 1910 really wanted to make the campaign more public. They wanted to bring the campaign into the streets to reach people in more direct ways. So by 1911, for example, there were 14 new suffrage leagues that were organized in Connecticut, including groups in New Haven and Bridgeport. Ella G. Fleck and Maud M. Hinks of Bridgeport were leaders of the suffrage movement in Fairfield County, as were Elsie Mary Hill and Helena Hill Weed of Norwalk. Little information is known about the role of African American women in the suffrage movement in Connecticut. The records state that CWSA activists campaigned among African American women, and that African American women also organized for suffrage. But the problem is that the information that we have is often just passing references in CWSA meeting minutes. CWSA records do not include more information, nor are there suffrage records that we know of that cover this information right now from other parts of the state. The CWSA itself does not seem to have made any statements about its racial politics or perspectives. The major local newspapers in Connecticut, local newspapers in general, which are usually the most helpful resource in uncovering the participation of African American suffragists generally throughout the country, because they were backed by Republicans in Connecticut, include little in this early time period about African American social and political reform in the state. Normally, we would then turn as scholars to historically Black newspapers to fill in the blanks, but the first African American newspaper in Connecticut was actually not published until the 1930s, and no issues of that publication still exist according to the state library. So it's really the lack of sources and not the lack of involvement that prevents scholars from writing about the topic in depth. What we do know, in 1918, the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association reported that a suffragist had spoken in New Haven to African American women at a congregational church. 500 African American women reportedly voted to organize a suffrage league in New Haven. CWSA activists spoke to African Americans in Stratford and in Willimantic. In Willimantic, they spoke to official boards of the Methodist, AME Zion, and Baptist churches. But those are the only notes we have on this work in the state, and they're from CWSA meeting minutes in 1918. The Black suffragist who's gotten the most coverage from Connecticut is Mary Townsend Seymour, who spoke out against racial discrimination in the movement in the late 1910s. We have limited resources about her activism, but her story is the most well documented. She was a social reformer and a war worker in Hartford. The Connecticut Historical Society has put together an exhibit examining politically active and socially engaged Black women in the 20th century. Most of the women that they have identified so far supported women's right to vote and the political engagement of Connecticut women in the period that followed the passage of the 19th Amendment via Black political clubs and groups such as the League of Women Voters. This would make them part of the next generation of suffragists who worked for the League and other groups in the mid to late 20th century. Turning back to the CWSA in the mid to late 1910s, perhaps the most ambitious and well-publicized tactic adopted by Connecticut suffragists, inspired by activists from New York and England, was the use of parades. CWSA state organizer Emily Pearson explained the importance of such an event in a 1914 speech. She said, quote, "The deep significance of a women's suffrage parade is hardly grasped by the casual observer. Only those who have together marched shoulder to shoulder for such a great ideal can realize the spiritual uplift which comes at such a time. To feel yourself part of a great movement is to forever end any self-consciousness." On May 3, 1914, Connecticut suffragists halted trolley traffic for over an hour, orchestrating one of the largest political demonstrations in the history of the state. The Current called it spectacular, estimating that more women participated in the first organized suffrage parade in 1914 than any prior procession at the Capitol. Both beautiful and orderly, the Connecticut suffrage parade furthered the imagery utilized by suffragists throughout the campaign, demonstrating that women could participate in the public and the political sphere without abandoning their femininity. Under Pearson's leadership, Emily Pearson's leadership, state suffragists also took advantage of other creative exhibits and displays. Most significantly, while historians credit Anna Constable of the Women's Political Union with introducing a tactic called Voiceless Speech to the New York suffrage campaign in 1913, the original form of this tactic was developed by Emily Pearson while doing out-of-state work in Ohio. It was used in Connecticut as early as 1912, part of a show window campaign through 10 cities. Voiceless speech involved a silent suffragist positioned next to an easel, flipping large cards with words or phrases for onlookers. The tactic was designed for show windows or busy street corners where the clamor of automobiles and crowds made traditional oratory presentation difficult. Receiving national acclaim, Emily Pearson traveled to Washington, D.C. in December 1913 to teach this tactic to aspiring advocates at the National Suffrage School. Although the event received little local press coverage, Pearson's role as a suffrage school teacher helped to build her national reputation and her relationship with prominent activists like Alice Paul, a suffragist from New Jersey, and Lucy Burns, a suffragist from New York, who she and other Connecticut activists would work more closely with beginning in 1917. So Lucy Burns, at the time, was one of the leaders of the Congressional Union, which was a body of NASA working in Washington, D.C., basically to focus on the passage of the 19th Amendment. And Lucy Burns was the organizer of the suffrage school that Emily Pearson was invited to speak at. I believe Emily was one of about 80 or 85 women across the whole country who was actually selected to be a suffrage school teacher at this event in Washington, D.C. By 1917, there were about 38,000 CWSA members. So the efforts of Pearson and Katharine Hepburn and some of these other new advocates in Connecticut were definitely paying off. So by 1917, there were about 38,000 members of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. But the organization continued to face constant opposition from conservatives, from big business, from the liquor industry in particular, who worried that women would support policies via the vote that would hurt their economic situation. By 1910, an anti-suffrage organization had even formed in Connecticut, and the main chapter of the anti-suffrage organization in Connecticut was actually in Hartford, but there were smaller branches throughout the state. The year 1917 marked a crucial year for the national suffrage movement and the Connecticut campaign. Tensions between NASA and Alice Paul's new, more radical suffrage organization, the National Woman's Party, created conflict between state branches of both organizations, prompting many notable women to switch allegiances. In January of 1917, the National Woman's Party sent suffrage pickets with controversial banners to the White House gates in Washington, D.C., to pressure President Woodrow Wilson and Congress to grant women the right to vote. The picketing continued as the United States entered World War I. While some people ignored the protests, once the US entered World War I, they became viewed, the protesters, as distracting and even an un-American group of radicals. Many people felt that the women should be surrendering to war work and work that would support the home front and not campaigning for the vote, especially in such a public way. So NASA refused to endorse the controversial tactics of the Women's Party in DC and the protests and demonstrations outside the White House gates. That year, an Irish woman named Katherine Flanagan became the first woman from Connecticut among several to be arrested in these protests. After refusing to pay a fine for obstructing traffic, Flanagan was sentenced to 30 days at the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, along with 5 other suffrage pickets. Lucy Burns, who visited the protesters, complained about their treatment and their lack of proper food. At Occoquan in particular, suffragists were emotionally and physically abused. Connecticut activists urged the state government to help Katherine Flanagan. Flanagan was the secretary of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association and in DC on a personal vacation at the time. Both the CWSA and the Connecticut branch of the National Women's Party initially supported her actions. And CWSA leaders at first affirmed that she had the right to use her vacation any way that she chose. Katharine Hepburn, CWSA president and chairman of the Connecticut branch of the NWP, or the CNWP, Lillian Ashcoff, sent, I don't want to confuse people, so I just want to make sure I say it right. So Katharine Hepburn, who is CWSA president and the chairman of the Connecticut branch of this NWP or the CNWP, Lillian Ashcoff was the chair at the time, sent Connecticut Congressman Augustine Launagram constant telegrams stating concerns about Flanagan's treatment at the workhouse until he visited the location in person. I almost said prison, but it wasn't really a prison. It was a workhouse in person. However, he asserted that he saw no causes for complaints, and that's a quote from him. Shortly after, prison officials transferred Katherine Flanagan to the hospital ward, where she spent 2 days. The Current reported that she suffered from nervousness and a rundown condition due to poor nourishment. After serving 24 days of her sentence, Flanagan was released early for good behavior. Upon return to Connecticut, she resigned from the CWSA to join the Connecticut branch of the NWP, which had formed in 1916. And so a lot of the women, women that were arrested during the demonstrations in DC, typically they were shipped to the Occoquan Workhouse like Katherine Flanagan, or they were sent to the District of Columbia Jail. Both places were very rough. And so in particular at the Occoquan Workhouse, women were given like hard green peaches to eat, food with worms in it, cornbread and bread that was so hard they couldn't even chew it. They were put in rooms where people were withdrawing from alcohol and other substances. They were given towels that were too small to cover their whole bodies, soap that had been shared with prostitutes and ordinary criminals. The conditions were really, really egregious. And actually, a lot of the women as they were sort of behind bars, right, they actually banded together and they tried to petition for better treatment and for reform, and actually better treatment for all prisoners during the time period. Occoquan was supposed to be like a state-of-the-art workhouse during the time period, and actually the conditions were pretty bad, and it was embarrassing as the reports of the suffragist treatment sort of leaked to the media during the time period. So again, when Katherine Flanagan returns from DC, she's sort of radicalized by her experience, and she no longer believes in the vision of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So she resigns from the CWSA, which is a branch of that organization, and she decides to become a member of the Women's Party again in 1916. Katherine Flanagan's resignation marked a turning point in Emily Pearson and her colleagues' suffrage activities. As Katherine Hepburn, Emily Pearson, and a large group of suffragists who joined the CWSA in 1910 also left with Katherine Flanagan at this moment. Echoing the feelings of her colleagues, Katherine Hepburn wrote in her official resignation from the CWSA, and she had been the group's president up until this point. So she resigned on September 19th, 1917, and this is a quote from her. "I have reluctantly come to feel that the policy of the National American Women's Suffrage Association is futile, academic, and out of date." So that's pretty harsh. In the aftermath of the picketing, tensions between the two organizations continued to increase, as more opinions of some CWSA officers conflicted with NASA's political agenda. So you had tensions between the CWS or the NAWSA and the NWP on the national level. At the state level, you also had some tensions between both state parties as well, the CNWP and the CWSA. Some scholars have argued that at the state level, the tensions weren't quite as hostile as they were at the national level, but there were certainly differences in opinions. While some CWSA officers actually resigned their executive offices, they didn't actually end their membership with the CWSA, even though they were officially part of the NWP's state organization as well. So they kept their membership, but they resigned their executive offices. The CWSA participated in food conservation activities, liberty loan drives. So this is what the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association did in contrast to the Women's Party during World War I. So food conservation during the war, liberty loan drives, they assisted with the influenza crisis, they donated to the Red Cross, and much more. But they did not picket the White House for women's right to vote. As a branch of NAWSA, members of the CWSA supported the policies of the National Association, which advocated either state or federal campaigning for women's suffrage in traditional ways, and war work to add to the home front. Catherine Ludington of Old Lyme was elected as CWSA president to replace Hepburn at this moment. And again, it was trying to get positive support for women's right to vote, to remake the suffrage campaign's image for these women. And they thought by supporting the war effort, they could get more support for the idea of a publicly engaged and politically active woman. And so they had a totally different strategy. They weren't demonstrating outside the White House. They were doing this more traditional work to try to improve the image of the suffragists. So working with the CNWP, Hepburn, Pearson, and supporters, in contrast, refocused their efforts on the federal amendment rather than the state campaign. Unlike the nonpartisan CWSA, women who were involved in the CNWP actively allied with politicians and even more aggressively lobbied congressmen for the passage of the 19th Amendment. So the CNWP and the NWP in general were much more political. They were really into being very partisan, lobbying politicians, very much playing the political game, whereas the CWSA was like, we want to get a positive, have the suffrage movement look more positive, more respectable. And so they had a slightly different approach to activism that was a little bit less directly political and a little bit more about reform and positive, making a positive sort of like image of the civically engaged woman, if that makes any more sense. Whereas the CNWP said, whatever it took really to push through the vote, even if that meant displaying themselves in a more radical or controversial light. After years of hard work and dedication by suffragists across the country, on June 4th, 1919, the federal government passed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and votes for women advocates needed 36 states to ratify the legislation for it to become official. And by the spring of 1920, NAWSA and NWP leaders hoped to secure Connecticut as its final state, despite continued longstanding and obvious opposition. Connecticut's General Assembly, however, was not scheduled to meet until January 1921. Despite the demands of the NWP and the encouragement of CWSA organizers, Marcus H. Holcomb, the acting state governor, persistently refused to call a special session to ratify the 19th Amendment. During protest week or emergency week, NAWSA sent 47 suffragists to Connecticut to pressure the governor to change his mind. These women, along with members of the NWP, argued that by failing to call a special session of the Connecticut legislature to pass the 19th Amendment, he was depriving women across the entire country of the right to vote in the 1920 election. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the Equal Suffrage Amendment on August 18, 1920 by one vote, Holcomb finally acted and called the special session. Connecticut's decision remained crucial as politicians and anti-suffragists across the country challenged the legality of Tennessee's actions. Connecticut officially granted women the right to vote on September 14, 1920, becoming the 37th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. It was really Connecticut's decision to come in and ratify the 19th Amendment after Tennessee was very, very important to winning women the right to vote, because again, people were challenging what had happened in Tennessee. And so having Connecticut just a few weeks later follow up with a positive vote really solidified that women would be granted this right and this amendment would pass across the country. So as the campaign for equal suffrage concluded, Votes for Women advocates refocused their attention on new issues and goals. The CWSA became the Connecticut League of Women Voters. The CNWP changed objectives to focus on campaigning for equal rights amendment, but largely lost support in the state by the 1920s, viewed as a radical feminist organization. The reason that the suffrage amendment passed in 1920, I argue, is that it had become a mainstream political issue that most Americans recognized, and a cause that an increasingly diverse group of women and men supported, even if it was for different reasons. It had moved from the margins to the center of politics and public consciousness by 1920. The amendment, however, was not the be-all and end-all, as although the amendment included no specific language that discriminated based on race, at the state and local level, many southern states, at the state and local level in many southern states, grassroots laws and policies were put in place blocking Black female suffrage, and other citizenship and immigration policies prevented Native American suffrage and Asian American suffrage. Women under 21 were also not allowed to vote into the 70s when the voting age was lowered nationally to 18. And a variety of other loopholes prevented other groups of women from exercising the franchise for different reasons across time as well. So thank you so much. That's what I have for my presentation.
Well, thank you, Kelly. That was wonderful, and a whole lot of wealth of information about not only Connecticut women, but kind of the differences between parties, which I felt was really interesting and I never really heard about before, especially women kind of leaving the National Women's Suffrage Association, right? Am I getting that right? Or the National Women's Party to, switching over. And it is interesting that the differences in tactics was really the key point of them leaving. And it really makes me think about today, and the importance of the vote today and how we get across what we want. On a very powerful stage, whether it's by local community organizing, positive efforts, whether it's through lobbying or social media activism. The opportunities that these women took in the late 19th and early 20th century to get the message out was really interesting. And I loved that you had our trolley poster in there. Thank you. So that's actually on display at the Fairfield Museum right now. If you'd like to see it, it's in actually Elsie Hill's scrapbook, who we do have some of her collections, including her National Women's Party membership card on display, which is very cool as part of one of our exhibits. Yeah. So I guess I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the tactics and the change in the different associations over time. Could you just reiterate kind of in a broad way which association did what and why it was important?
So NASA, they got involved, a lot of members of NASA got involved. They wanted the vote because they wanted to push through like a larger social and political reform agenda. So a lot of their tactics were typically going out into the community and joining forces with other clubs and organizations to help with events that were already going on. And then to, wear a suffrage button, pass out literature at those events, just kind of make their name known, and associated also with positive causes that had to do with like anti-prostitution and anti-gambling, cleaning up the city, charity work, anything that would make the suffrage movement have like a more positive image and reputation, and also associate that idea of like a politically or civically engaged woman with a really positive, again, sort of image. So they were really involved in, again, a lot of reform work, penal reform, a lot of reform type work, the prohibition movement, whereas the National Women's Party and the local branches are going to do similar things as well. The National Women's Party and its associated branches, they didn't really care as much about what their like reputation was publicly. They just wanted to make it in the headlines of the news, and no matter what that meant, even if it meant getting arrested, even if it meant destroying property, doing something controversial. It never got too radical like it did in the UK and the US, but they just wanted to make the headlines, even if it was negative publicity.
That's an interesting comparison to today's news and media outlets. So now, I'm also interested in, there's some very specific tactics that women across the board use to get the message out about voting. And we touch on a little bit of that in the exhibit. There's, of course, sending out a solidified message. And if you were to give that message today, what would you think it would be? I know they used very specific phrases. They use very specific means in order to get out specific phrases. But if you could kind of sum that up for the suffrage movement in the late 20th century, what would it have been?
I think for these women, I think they saw the vote as something that was very powerful, that it had a possibility to create very real change. I think they would encourage people of all backgrounds really to take advantage of their political voice and to participate. I think that, like I said, I think by 1920 it had resonated as a cause that a lot of different groups took up. And I think the reasons they were taking it up were very different, like depending on background, but it was something people all agreed was necessary to create change and, and was important. And so, I think today they would encourage people to vote, go out and take advantage of this with this upcoming election.
Absolutely. Vote. Get your vote out, right? That's our duty and our responsibility and our privilege as an American citizen today. And I have one real final question, and it might end up with some follow-up questions. So we actually get a lot of comments and questions in Fairfield at the museum about women who were anti-suffrage. And I would love to have you talk a little bit about the Anti-Suffrage Association in Connecticut, which you touched on just a little bit. I know because we're talking about really the fight for the vote, but we always get the, well, why would women not want the right to vote?
So there was in the 1800s, a lot of the women who were anti-suffrage basically they used a lot of like old-fashioned arguments to protest the women's suffrage movement. So they would say like women and men are naturally suited for different roles in life. Women have smaller brain size than men, or women aren't intellectually sophisticated enough to be politically engaged, or they would become tired and worn out if they had these other types of duties that were more taxing. So they don't fit. And a lot of them, the anti-suffragists, were men. Eventually they were women over time too. So they would say they don't have this isn't the natural place for them within society. It's natural that men and women are different. They belong in different spheres. And the suffragists aren't good mothers, or not good wives. They don't know how to take care of their home. They had all these posters that basically mocked the politically engaged and modern woman. And a lot of that like continued those types of arguments up until about 1910. And then you see sort of like a shift in the arguments the antis are using, and the antis start to realize they're sort of losing, and they have to update some of their campaign tactics and their arguments. So they get more public and political, and their arguments get more political and get more about equality. So they'll say, oh, look at the suffrage states. Look at what's gone on in the suffrage in states where women could vote prior to 1920. Has any real change occurred? Oh, the women vote similar to men. They're not adding anything positive. They're not morally superior. They're not improving society. Nothing happened since they were enfranchised. So why do we need to give them the ballot? They've really done nothing to change, what was going on in society. Or they'd say, actually, suffrage is, if we give women the vote, we're going to be also promoting radicalism, socialism, communism, and all these other controversial causes. We're going to be backing the birth control movement, the labor movement. So they'll link it with other radical political causes as a challenge. And so, like I said, the original suffrage organization, or anti-suffrage organization, started in, I think, about 1910, and it was in Hartford, like the first major branch. Then it spread. I think it had about 9 branches throughout the state over time. Quite a large membership over time. Old Lyme, I think it was Old Lyme, had a pretty large branch, and there was a reason that it was actually that Woodrow Wilson he was at first anti-suffrage until World War I, and he had spent a number of years actually living or staying with his wife in Old Lyme in the summer. She was participating in the art colony there, and so he was really respected in the state. And the state, a lot of the leading politicians, some of them even had cross-party support, and they were Republican conservatives. And so, again, these are reasons why they would, the people in the state would be anti-suffrage. They were, again, Republican, very conservative, pro-big business, pro-liquor industry because it was money-making industry. Again, pro-Woodrow Wilson, who was anti-suffrage up until World War I, even though his daughters actually supported the movement. And actually, I believe, like, I just gave a presentation on this a couple weeks ago, but it's slipping my mind. Though Florence Griswold, I believe, was a leading anti-suffrage activist in Old Lyme. I think she was like a secretary of the anti-suffrage organization there. So it did, for every action, especially by 1910, that the suffragists took, the anti-suffragists had, an opposite opposite reaction that was a very real reaction against them. So it wasn't just like men speaking out, but there were these organized women speaking out, promoting like a more conservative vision for female citizenship.
Yeah, we've seen a few things at the Fairfield Museum where the anti-suffrage women leaders in Fairfield actually really acknowledge the fact that they're looking back into the old time of it was better back then. Women should have this home stance. They should be supportive of almost kind of a colonial effort of Connecticut and the founding of Connecticut. And I'm saying these words only because it really does they always have this kind of conversation about looking back to a better time. The way that we use and we look at the past often as rose with those rose-colored glasses. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about that. So then here's a follow-up question, and this may go maybe both beyond of our knowledge sets, but what has the women's vote done for Connecticut, let's say in particular? Do we know?
I think after 1920, like it's interesting because after 1920, even women that were opposed to suffrage, a lot of them registered as voters. And a lot of women did join political parties after that time period. People have been critical of the voter turnout rates that followed the passage of the 19th Amendment, I know. But even if, I think, I would say even if women weren't exercising the ballot necessarily in the way that the suffragists had hoped, there were still women taking like a more aggressive and active role in like civic life and public life after this time period. There were new jobs available to women in government. Even within colleges and universities, a lot of political science departments started to accept female faculty. Female students started to demand access and register to in political science and government classes. So I think there's like a social and cultural change, and even just becoming involved in like certain civic clubs or political clubs and organizations and taking a more active role in those in the period that followed, I think is significant. Even if it wasn't just the voting numbers like skyrocketed, there's these other actions that happened that were important.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have some really great archives associated with a woman from Fairfield, Finette Benson Nichols, who was, we believe, I think the first Fairfield, Connecticut woman in the state legislature. And, she was actually incredibly anti-suffrage. And of course, after 1920, began to play a huge role in not only politics, but also elected office, as well as civic and pushing forward legislation to support social women and families movements. And that was, for us at the museum, it's something that we love to look into and share with people to understand how women over time sometimes develop different positions depending on the social and cultural era. And that happens with everyone, whether no matter what gender and or background that you come from. So it's always, history is one of those things that's constantly changing. And local history are one of the key parts of American history, like you really talked about today with Connecticut women who did things over time that were part of a national movement, but meant so much to grassroots activism and change on a local level, because without that local grassroots activism get the message out, things don't change for a long time on a national level. And so that key local history and understanding what happened was so important. Is there anything else that you want to share with your lovely viewership today?
Well, I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to share this information. I think this is one of the last presentations I get to do for the year on this topic, so I really enjoyed it. It's a great story, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for future work and scholarship on a lot of areas, because there isn't a lot published on the state history, so in a lot of the activists.
Absolutely. And there's so many important people that we love to talk about and, have so much history. And it sounds like, from your presentation, the amount of avenues for future historians there are to look into digging through all of those primary source materials and new avenues that still are yet to be discovered, because history is always on the move. So thank you so much. And a special thank you to our funders again today, the Fairfield County Community Foundation Fund for Women and Girls and Connecticut Humanities, and our friends from the Fairfield, Connecticut League of Women Voters. We always appreciate everyone's support. And here at the Fairfield Museum, again, you can see our upcoming events at our website, www.fairfieldhistory.org. And you can also, we would love, as always, this is a free program. We are a nonprofit at the museum, and so we rely on all of the support from viewers like you and all of our audience and communities. So after we say goodbye here, there'll be a donation screen. If you're interested in supporting the museum, please, please do. We really appreciate all of your efforts, so that way we can keep bringing you cool programs and awesome historians like Dr. Kelly Marino. So a special thank you to everyone who tuned in today. And this will be available on our YouTube page and Facebook page indefinitely for a long time. So you can review at any point in time. If you have any follow-up questions, please post in the comments and questions, and we'll be sure to get to those as soon as possible. Thank you again, and thank you to Dr. Kelly Marino for joining us today. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.